Dr. Benjamin Carter. A name that carried weight in every corner of this small California town. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a savior. Families trusted him. Mothers brought their children to him. Patients swore he worked miracles. But behind that charming smile and white coat, there was something wrong. Something that no one saw coming. Benjamin Carter seemed to have it all. A thriving career in one of California's top hospitals. A beautiful home, a loving daughter, and a spotless reputation. Every handshake, every word, every glance made people feel safe. He was the kind of doctor you'd recommend to everyone you know. But sometimes, the people who look the safest are the ones you should fear the most. In exam rooms, behind closed doors, when no one was watching, Dr. Carter did things no one could imagine. He would use his position, his charm, and even his medical knowledge to strip his patients of their power, their dignity, and, worst of all, their safety. Dr. Carter had a method, one that was terrifyingly simple. He'd inject his patients with just enough to make them weak, to make them lose control. Then he'd wait. He knew they couldn't fight back, couldn't remember clearly, and wouldn't dare speak up even if they did. Imagine waking up and feeling like something was wrong. Your body feels off. You're confused, but you can't explain why. You tell yourself it's all in your head. Because, after all, Dr. Carter is a doctor. You trust him. He's there to help you, isn't he? And so, his victims stayed silent. They were too scared, too ashamed, too unsure. While Dr. Carter walked the halls of that hospital, head held high, knowing he was untouchable. The scary part? He didn't hide. He didn't need to. People trusted him too much to question him. His colleagues saw him as a star. His patients saw him as a healer. And his victims? They were left to carry their pain alone. How many nights did they sit in silence, replaying those moments? How many of them cried themselves to sleep, questioning everything they thought they knew about him? How many others were next in line, not knowing they'd become just another story he'd bury beneath his perfect mask? But here's the thing about people like Dr. Carter, they always leave cracks in their armor. And eventually, those cracks are what bring them down. What happened next? What made this trusted doctor's perfect world come crashing down? Stick around to find out, because this story is far from over. And trust me, it only gets darker from here. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss what comes next. Let's unravel the truth together. It was supposed to be just another night. Quiet, uneventful. Pastor Elijah Monroe sat by his wife's hospital bed, praying for her recovery. But what he saw that night would shatter his faith in everything he thought he knew, and turn a trusted man into the town's greatest disgrace. Margaret Monroe had been admitted to the hospital earlier that day for a routine procedure. Nothing major, just enough to make her husband worry. So, Elijah stayed by her side, holding her hand and whispering prayers as she rested. He was a man of God, a protector of his family, and a husband who believed in standing by his wife, no matter what. Late into the night, he decided to step out for a cup of coffee. He didn't know it then, but that small decision would change everything. When Elijah returned to the room, something wasn't right. The door was slightly ajar, and he heard movement inside. Confused, he pushed it open, only to find Dr. Benjamin Carter leaning over his unconscious wife. His hands were where they shouldn't have been. His intentions were as clear as day. Elijah froze. For a moment, his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. This couldn't be real. Not Dr. Carter. Not the man who had promised to care for Margaret. But the longer he stood there, the clearer the truth became. His wife wasn't safe, not in this room, not in this hospital. Anger boiled over, drowning out every other thought. Elijah wasn't just a preacher in that moment, he was a husband whose wife was being violated. Without thinking, he charged at Dr. Carter, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "What the hell are you doing?" Elijah roared, his voice echoing through the halls. Nurses rushed in, security was called, and chaos erupted. Dr. Carter tried to explain, to lie his way out of it, but there was no hiding now. Not with Elijah's righteous fury lighting up the entire floor. Word spread quickly. By morning, everyone in the hospital knew. By the next day, the entire community was talking. Dr. Carter, the man they had trusted with their lives, was exposed as a predator. Margaret was too shaken to speak, but Elijah made sure her story was heard. He demanded justice, not just for his wife, but for anyone else who had suffered in silence. The arrest of Dr. Benjamin Carter was a moment no one in the town would ever forget. It wasn't just the fall of a man, it was the tearing down of a lie everyone had believed for far too long. But as Elijah stood in the courthouse, watching Dr. Carter being led away in handcuffs, a bitter truth gnawed at him. Jail time didn't feel like enough. Not for what this man had done. Not for the pain he had caused. For Elijah, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because when justice feels like it's failed you, what do you do next? Stick around. This story is just getting started. When Dr. Benjamin Carter was sentenced to prison, most people thought justice had been served. But not Elijah Monroe. To him, prison bars weren't enough to make up for the nights his wife cried herself to sleep. For the way her laughter was stolen. For the man she would never fully be again. No, justice hadn't been served, not by a long shot. Sitting in that courtroom, Elijah felt hollow. He'd fought so hard to see Dr. Carter put away. He'd wanted the judge to throw the book at him. But 12 years behind bars? It felt like a slap on the wrist. How do you explain that to your wife? How do you look her in the eyes and tell her the man who destroyed her life will one day walk free? Elijah tried to find peace in his faith, in the idea of forgiveness. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Carter's smug face. He thought about all the lives Carter had ruined, including his own. And the anger grew louder. Elijah's prayers turned into silence. His silence turned into obsession. He stopped preaching, stopped visiting the church altogether. People whispered about him in town, saying he looked different, like a man haunted by something no one else could see. It started small. He began tracking the Carter family, reading every article, watching every news clip. That's when he learned about Emily, Benjamin Carter's only daughter. A bright, cheerful 19-year-old college student. She had nothing to do with her father's crimes, but Elijah didn't care. In his eyes, Benjamin Carter had taken his wife's innocence. And now, Elijah wanted to take something from him. Elijah's anger became a plan, and the plan became his purpose. For weeks, he followed Emily. He learned her routines, her favorite spots on campus, the coffee shop where she studied late into the night. To anyone else, she was just a young girl with her whole life ahead of her. But to Elijah, she was leverage. She was the way to make Benjamin Carter feel the same helplessness he had inflicted on others. And here's the thing about anger, it blinds you. Elijah didn't see Emily for who she really was, an innocent girl, untainted by her father's sins. All he saw was a means to an end. As Elijah's plan took shape, there was no turning back. His grief had turned into something unrecognizable. Something dangerous. The question was no longer if he'd do it, but when. What happens when the preacher becomes the predator? When vengeance twists the soul beyond repair? Stay with me, because the next chapter will leave you questioning everything. Revenge has a way of turning the righteous into the damned. And for Elijah Monroe, the line between justice and punishment blurred the moment he decided to make Emily Carter pay for her father's crimes. What he didn't know was that his quest for vengeance would lead him down a dark road he could never come back from. It was late one evening when Elijah finally made his move. He knew exactly where Emily would be. That little cafe she always visited, the one with the bright lights and the aroma of fresh coffee. She'd been studying for exams, blissfully unaware that her life was about to change forever. Elijah watched her from the shadows, his heart pounding with rage. He didn't care that she was innocent. In his mind, she was still part of the man who had destroyed his wife's soul. He waited for the right moment, and when she walked out the door alone, he pounced. 1 minute, Emily was walking to her car. The next, she was being dragged into a van, her screams muffled by the cold air and the panic in her chest. Elijah never said a word. He just drove, his hands shaking with adrenaline. It didn't matter where they went. What mattered was what he was going to do next. For the next few days, Emily was trapped in a dark, small room. Elijah's anger twisted every thought in his mind, and his actions followed. Emily didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure: she was terrified. The man who had once been a preacher, a protector, now stood before her as a monster. His voice was cold, his eyes hollow, no trace of the man she'd once heard about in church. Elijah told her things, horrible things. He blamed her for the sins of her father, for the pain her family had caused. He wanted her to feel everything he had felt. But what he didn't understand was that Emily wasn't her father. She wasn't guilty of anything. She just wanted to survive. The man who had once stood before his congregation, offering comfort and hope, was now unrecognizable. Elijah had crossed a line he could never return from. The man who preached love, forgiveness, and mercy was now consumed with hate. Every prayer he had once offered to God seemed like a lie, because no part of him cared about anything except his need for revenge. The preacher was gone, replaced by a man driven by darkness and anger. And as the days wore on, he grew more desperate. More violent. More lost. He told himself it was justice. He told himself Emily had to pay. But deep down, Elijah knew he was something else now. Something worse. It wasn't long before Emily's family realized something was wrong. The police were called, and it didn't take long for them to find her. When they finally rescued her, she was broken, physically and emotionally. She couldn't speak for days. And when she did, she described a man she no longer recognized, a man she had trusted in another life. But the damage was already done. Elijah's actions didn't just ruin his life, they shattered his entire community. His family, his congregation, and the people who had once looked up to him now saw the truth. The man they had followed was no more. The preacher was gone, and all that remained was the man who had let revenge consume him. Elijah Monroe had crossed a line that would never be undone. And for that, there was no turning back. 2 lives destroyed. Elijah Monroe's quest for revenge didn't just ruin his own life, it shattered everything he once stood for. The arrest came quickly. Elijah's quiet descent into darkness had led him to this moment, and there was no turning back. He was dragged out of his home in handcuffs, the same man who once preached peace now facing charges for the unthinkable. The trial was a media frenzy. The man who had led his congregation for years, who had promised to protect them from evil, was now sitting in a courtroom, accused of kidnapping and assault. Elijah tried to justify his actions. He claimed it was for his wife, for the justice she deserved. But the truth was clear to everyone who watched: Elijah's anger had clouded his judgment, and now he would pay for it. His family, once proud of his role in the community, could only watch in silence as the world turned against him. His wife, devastated by everything, couldn't even look at him. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. She was a victim too. But Elijah wasn't the only one facing consequences. As his trial unfolded, more women came forward, victims of Dr. Benjamin Carter's abuse. His once pristine reputation crumbled as each new story added to the pile. He was no longer the trusted doctor everyone thought he was. He was the monster they never saw coming. Dr. Carter's fall from grace was swift. His wealth and status couldn't shield him from the truth. The community that had once trusted him now looked at him with disgust. And as more victims stepped into the light, it became clear that the damage he had caused ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The pain, however, wasn't confined to the courtroom. The toll on everyone involved was unimaginable. The victims, Emily Carter and so many others, had to live with the scars of their abuse. No one could undo the harm that had been done. For Emily, the girl who had once been a symbol of innocence, the world had turned upside down. She had lost her freedom, her peace, and her trust in people she thought would protect her. Her life, her future, was forever changed by Elijah's anger. Elijah's family, especially his wife, could never go back to who they once were. Even if Elijah paid for his crime, could they ever heal? Could anyone in that town ever move on from what had happened? Elijah thought he could fix things by taking revenge, but all he had done was create more pain. In the end, Elijah sat in that courtroom, staring at the faces of those he had betrayed. Was it worth it? Was the revenge that had consumed him really worth the destruction it caused? When revenge becomes the answer, does anyone truly win? Elijah lost everything. Dr. Carter lost everything. The victims, their families, and the entire town lost more than they could ever have imagined. So, I leave you with this: when anger turns into action, when the need for justice blinds you, who really pays the price? Is there such a thing as true justice, or does it just create more suffering? Think about it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.